Thank you to everybody for inviting us, and thank you to all the folks who technically have made this possible. Monica and I will each introduce ourselves briefly, and then we're going to try to make this as much of a conversation as it is presentation, and I think the questions and answers will allow for some of that. I will briefly introduce myself. I am currently a fellow with Generations United, which even from my biased perspective is, I think, one of, if not the leading intergenerational organization in the country. They are referenced in the resources page. Their website is filled with all kinds of wonderful information, reports, activities, and they've been at that work since the late 1980s. I've been working on issues affecting children and families and the communities and institutions that children and families depend on for over 5 decades. The two most relevant things I want to just touch on are, number one, about 20 years ago, I was the director of a library organization some of you may be familiar with. Libraries for the Future is a national organization. It was around for a little over 2 decades, and we work to support public libraries. One notable piece of work that I did there, which may have relevance for today, is right after Katrina hit the Gulf Coast, we were involved with the help of some large grants to help rebuild libraries and reimagine libraries in both New Orleans and along the Mississippi coast. So for roughly 3 to 4 years, I worked in New Orleans. Not a bad gig. The other thing I wanted to just touch on is that I do have a long history in working on aging issues, aging across the spectrum of from early childhood to the later active years of life. And that'll come in, I think, into our conversation when we talk about the intergenerational side of things. As I mentioned, I'm currently a fellow. I'm also a consultant to Monica and the Yspilanti Children's Center. Senior Center. Children's Center.
I don't know where that came from.
There you go. Senior Center, which we're trying to turn into an intergenerational center. You'll hear more about that. And then I grew up in Michigan. I am from the greater Detroit area. I was born in Detroit, so I know your communities well. And I'm happy to see if we can be of help to you. And I will turn it over to Monica, director of the Senior Center in Yspilanti.
Yes, I've been the director of the Senior Center since 2006, so it's been a while. But before that, I came into this position as a fine artist and as a Girl Scout leader. I spent 25 years directing a Girl Scout day camp that was totally run by volunteers. So I was very involved with both kids and the adults that helped out in the program. So I've always been very interested in having young and old work together. It just seems a very natural thing to me. And even from the start, I have, at the Senior Center, I've had things where I'd invite homeschoolers to come in to an art class, because of course I taught the art classes at that time. One other thing is we're a very small center, and we had financial difficulties from the beginning. The city was about to close it, and we decided to try and keep it open. So it was like bare roots. And so the major thing we had to do was work with partners. I had to form a relationship with the community college so that we could get some exercise instructors. We paired up with Eastern for all kinds of things, Eastern Michigan University, because they're only about 8 blocks away from us. And partnerships became a very important place in our center. So we spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to work with partners. And if we could start our slideshow,
Yes.
and then.
So I'm gonna go to share screen on my end and go to your PowerPoint. Share.
And we pretty much finished the first section.
I think we entitled this "The Potential for New Intergenerational Places and Partnerships," recognizing that both libraries, public libraries, and senior centers have long been intergenerational centers. But we're trying to have you begin to reimagine what intergenerational could be in your library and in your community. So that's why the title is what it is. We started out in our slide presentation with the idea that both libraries, public libraries, and senior centers were kind of unusual creations of the public government, of our public sector. They were both created as community spaces by design, and more or less intergenerational from the beginning. Senior centers a little less so, although they eventually became major locations for families as well as the older people, and caretakers and caregivers. The two institutions really do kind of occupy some common ground. And so that was one of the things we started with. We were just trying to think of things that they share in common. We also talked about the fact that they have really important missions, especially today. Both are places that people can come to for information, for support, and for connection. I think even before COVID, the issue of social isolation was a growing concern. And you just have to look in the papers almost on a daily basis to see all the articles about mental health and isolation of both older and younger populations. So libraries and senior centers are also just shared missions around connecting people and providing a range of activities and support. Both senior centers and libraries struggle to survive. Yearly budgets are never guaranteed. And there's other struggles, which I won't get into now, but we're in an interesting political moment. And then lastly, we really wanted to look at both of these institutions as leaders in kind of reimagining how to work with the public across the age spectrum through a variety of partnerships and through community priorities. So those were some of the things that we wanted to establish at the beginning as sort of a base for moving forward. We'll get into talking now about a little bit more about what intergenerational looks like, but this is I think a helpful background.
Yeah, and one of the things I wanted to say about this too is that, I've been in the senior center for 18 years, and this particular senior center has been around for over 60 years now. And it is totally different from when it first started.
Yeah.
When it first started, it was, they had a men's group that came one day, and during that men's group, the women came and cooked lunch for them. And then on another day, they had a women's group that did service projects, and they all brought bag lunches from home. And, it was just, that's the way it was 60 years ago. And even since I started, it was more of a clubhouse when I first came in. And with the baby boomers coming in, it has become more of a program-oriented center. So people come for specific programs more than just to spend the day at the senior center. And just, to emphasize again, is because we're not backed by the city, we're pretty much, it's a city building, but they don't pay our salaries. So partnerships have always been super important and just for us to survive.
A lot of dependence on grants and contributions.
Yes.
There's a lot of definitions for intergenerational. I think what I find interesting is when I'm at conferences and I introduce myself and I mention the word intergenerational, the entire table perks up and says, "Oh, that's interesting." So there's a lot of interest in it, but not a lot of clarity or uniform understanding of what it is. This is one definition that the National Council on Aging, which is probably the leading national organization in support of senior centers. So this is how they look at it. The Generations United, as I mentioned, has its own definitions. The bottom line is it talks about mutual benefits and how we learn from one another, there's a give and take with one another, and that there's kind of the sum of the whole is greater than the individual parts. And so this is one definition, but if you start to get into this, I'm sure you'll find other definitions as well. We wanted to begin with a definition, and we wanted to also begin with some very fundamental questions about why. Why are intergenerational programs important? Why, as Aaron and some of the other folks at the beginning mentioned, that it was some of the other folks putting this together, it's become a particular topic of interest. I think there's a lot of reasons for that, but we'll just touch on a few. Number one, in these days of tight budgets, I think the argument could be made that this is a good investment. Intergenerational work is a good investment. It's not, programs that benefit both older and younger populations mean that you're not having to create separate siloed programs as much. So that's one particular motivating factor. Another motivating factor is, I think, the fact that you have more interest, particularly since COVID, of generations in greater contact with one another, more awareness. You had a tremendous uptick during COVID of families from across their family generations moving back in with one another and sharing households. How well that was is up for some debate, but there certainly was, and there still continues to be, a lot of multi-generational families and households. And I think increasingly people are looking to co-locate sites. So putting childcare centers near retirement homes is one good example. But there's other examples, and there's other programmatic attractions that I think in priorities that pertain to both young and old. I'll touch on just one or two, and then if Monica wants to add, I just want to make sure we'll get into that next. Excuse me. I think the most probably common intergenerational programs outside of whatever you do at your particular libraries, the ones people are most familiar with are when young people come and visit older people in different kinds of usually institutional settings. And those visitations are very nice and appreciated. And then the flip on that is when older folks, including sometimes people in their 60s, 70s, 80s, it varies, will volunteer to work with younger people. They'll work with them in different ways, helping them with reading, helping them with outings and things like that. But there's a kind of a mentor role that they play. And again, those are very nice programs. There's a third dimension, which we will talk about in a minute, which is more intergenerational by design, where the young and the older populations, young in this case could be as young as elementary school, but it's usually youth are the most active, younger partners, come together to identify issues that they share in common, issues and interests that they share in common, and then begin to talk about what they might do to encourage more of that. It could be more programs, it could be more policies, more budgets that will result in better transportation, better healthcare. So there's a whole other dimension beyond those initial programs that I mentioned that we would like to emphasize, and we believe strongly that the libraries have a really critical role to play. I'll stop there and let Monica talk about the next slide.
The screen on your left there, you've got two circles, and that's where we've been at, is there. In fact, at the center that I was at for years, the seniors had the daytime, and then in the afternoon, evening, there were youth programs in the same building, but they never saw each other. They never talked to each other. And where we're trying to go by design is more of the intergenerational, which is on the right-hand side, where there's the older people still have a place for themselves, and the younger still a place for themselves, but overlapping, they can accomplish a whole lot of things. I have, in one grant that I got many years ago, we did a workshops for both seniors and young teen women. And we started thinking about what they had in common and basically realized everything. Self-defense was an issue with both seniors and teen girls. Finances was an issue because a lot of the women that came to the program had just lost their spouses, and so they all of a sudden had to take over all the finances in their house. Teens had no idea how to work on finances, how to even write a check, although most people don't write checks anymore. I think even the seniors are getting out of writing checks. Yeah, so the things like that, safety, transportation, food security are all issues that all of them deal with. So what we're doing is looking for those things that people have in common. Art is a great thing. This summer, we're working with a teen group where we're going to have an intergenerational play that we're going to put on in August. We're going to work on it all summer. And everybody likes to get in front of a camera or on stage. So it's going to be really exciting. So what we're looking at is, what do we have currently, the spaces, and what we offer now, and how can we turn it into intergenerational?
Sure. I want to back up for 1 minute before I jump into that and talk about when I knocked on Monica's door 5 or 6 years ago. I'm losing track of time now, to see if she wanted to be part of an intergenerational initiative that we had funding from the Michigan Health Endowment Fund gave us the original money to address social isolation, as I mentioned. Monica was more than welcoming. She embraced the idea, and we've been working together since then. one of the first things we did was start to identify some partners in the community. And I think that perhaps the very first partner that, there was a history of partnership, as Monica mentioned, at the center. But the first serious sort of sit-down conversation we had about intergenerational took place when I came to this library that we're sitting in today. And again, I had a brief introduction. I was able to connect pretty easily because of my past work with libraries. And we had a really good conversation about working together, and we've been working since then. But it was interesting because one of the things we identified was the Whitaker branch of the Yspilanti library, this district library, beautiful, relatively new facility, very well attended, has both a senior advisory council and a youth advisory council, which I thought was great. And then I just asked an innocent question, sort of loaded. Do they ever meet together or talk together? And the answer was, no. So it just sort of suggests it's a good example, even a kind of a metaphor for how we approach intergenerational at times. It can be side by side, but it doesn't necessarily overlap. And that's why that diagram brought together those two circles to show that you really focus on that middle overlapping space. And what I'm going to talk about in the next slide, which is on some of those possibilities within the library and within the community, but particularly within the library. In a sense, it's like taking a fresh look at things that are ongoing in the library. We're not necessarily asking for libraries to have to break down walls and build new spaces for people to get together. We want them to think about new ways to approach some of the things they do anyways. And so this slide talks about everything from, again, the familiar having consoles or just gathering places is another example of what are so central to libraries. So those can become more intergenerational, but I would caution, you have to have a plan and you really have to ease into it. There'll be resistance at first, even healthy resistance, we like as Monica said, we like our space, or we don't want a lot of noise, or, we'll work with young people outside the building. So I think you have to think strategically about how to introduce it. Another area would be special programs that could bring attention to intergenerational. Increasingly, there's a lot of grandparents interacting with grandkids, some cases raising grandkids. There's just, the numbers are up nationally quite significantly. Generations United is doing national work around grandparents raising grandkids. There was efforts to begin to do some support work and find places of respite for some of the grandparents at senior centers. I think that's an area that could really benefit from library involvement. So that's another example. Caregiving in general is a topic that is important for all of us to come to grips with, given how much caregiving affects every one of us. Either we've been doing caregiving, we're currently doing caregiving, we will be doing caregiving for younger or for older members of the family, or one day we'll be receiving caregiving. So there's a lot of reasons to get involved in caregiving. There's other things that I think go a little more broadly, which have to do with, I think, the role of public libraries originally, which were to make communities more educated and healthier places for people to grow up and grow old. And so, adopting a theme around making, healthy aging across the generations is an area libraries would be a natural. It would take some work. Again, I think it's not something that you just do off the top of your head. And then I mentioned leadership. I think these are both important roles for senior centers and for libraries. They're respected agencies, even if they're not always well-funded. but they do have the ear of a lot of the community, and I think they can play a role in talking about what would make our communities more ready to serve and support all ages. I think that would be a natural extension of some of the work you do now. Last but not least, I'll wrap up with the idea that any of those above ideas that I touched on also lend themselves to potential new funding sources for libraries. I know libraries do go outside of their normal funding channels at times to foundations and even to the public to raise additional monies to do additional special projects. And I think taking on any of those early parts of the things I talked about are great potential for raising new money. And I'll say this as a concluding point, excuse me. I did spend, after I did the work in New Orleans, I also spent a number of years in philanthropy. And I know that they're always looking for new approaches to tried and true ideas. And so talking about intergenerational reimagined at the library and in the community through partnerships, through programs would have some appeal. You'd have to make a good case, but I think it's worth a shot.
The only thing I wanted to add with that is with the new funding and the leadership roles is we found that we've spent a lot of time educating folk. The Ann Arbor Community Foundation has a great senior program. They have money that they give away every year, and it's fabulous. Well, a multi-generational program or an intergenerational program doesn't really fit into that unless you can talk it, you know. And we've been able to get them to see that this is part of building a community, that having things that are both for older adults and for younger people that help both, you know, that both contribute to and both age groups benefit from. That is something that it builds community, and I think it's going to be something in the future that is really necessary in especially small communities, which we have.
Next slide.
Next slide.
We've tried to come up with a fairly simple approach for you to think about this work. And there really are sort of three areas that we would like to emphasize. The first is intergenerational spaces or places. That is important. It's not, as I suggested earlier, it's not as easy as just calling a place that. You have to really kind of find ways for people to get introduced to it and feel some ownership with it. Sometimes input into what those spaces could look like is a nice way to do that. There is, I think one of the references that we include at the back mentions Penn State University, which is one of the leading intergenerational programs. And they talk about intergenerational contact zones. This is a term that came from some international work around intergenerational, but those contact zones can take place anywhere in the community. They are, you know, in buildings, in parks, in different places, in retail areas as well. The reason I mention this work through Penn State is that they talk a lot about what it takes to create common space, shared space. And there's another woman who was at Temple University, Nancy Henkin, who's now also a fellow at Generations United. Nancy has done some great work at shared site and how you create it and how you sustain it. So intergenerational spaces, intergenerational partners, Monica has mentioned over the years, there's been a number of partnerships and many continue. Making them a little bit more robust is sort of where we're at right now. It's one thing to have people who are interested It's another thing to have actual partners who have resources and can work side by side with the senior center. But I think partners working with libraries in the senior centers is an interesting approach. And then last is, I kind of alluded to it earlier, is that there's community needs out there, community opportunities, community assets even. And it's really, I think, lends itself, again, to some of the things that libraries do by nature. We just list 3 examples: lifelong learning, health and wellness, and arts and culture. There's a long list, and I think if you go to the benefits reference from Generations United, which lists how intergenerational programs benefit everybody, that's in fact what it's called. There's also a list there, a partial list of those common issues that bring together those various audiences. And we just highlight lifelong learning as one because it's obviously part of what the libraries do. There's an interesting flip side to that, which is the Stanford Center for Longevity has been using the phrase and the concept, introducing the concept of long life learning, considering that people are living roughly 50% longer in this century than they did 100 years ago. Late 40s and the early 1900s was the average lifespan, and now it's in the mid to late 70s. There's a lot more life that people are living in. So long life learning is another interesting way to think about some of the things we could be doing. We mentioned health and wellness just because it's not only an individual thing, but it's a family and a community. How healthy are our communities? How can the libraries and senior centers play a role in making for healthier environments to be supportive? That's a critical issue today. And then last, arts and cultures is obviously, we come back to the fact that we want to have a lot of fun with people in doing intergenerational work. Fun, food, fitness, music. There's a lot of things that are very basic, and we would suggest incorporating any and all when you can.
One of the things when we first started looking at the whole intergenerational world, is we brought together 4 or 5 seniors and 4 or 5 middle school aged Girl Scouts. And we spent the summer basically talking over things, like we'd walk around the senior center and say, how can this change? How, what needs to be changed for it to be more appealing for all ages? We walked around the park that is next to the senior center, and we had some great ideas, and we've passed those on to the city. Whether it happens or not is another story. But they were the ones that sort of came up with the fact that we need lifelong learning, health and wellness, and arts and culture joined together. So it was definitely, we got input from all age groups, and we also are continually getting feedback from all age levels, because some things people might not be interested in, or that, we always need to evaluate with both ages. So
Next one. All right.
So this sort of sums up a little bit that we were talking about what were some of the motivations for doing intergenerational programming. And, very simply that, but importantly, that sense of connection is so important. Young people, when we meet with them, their single greatest sort of wish would be for more places that were welcoming and safe for them to gather in the community. Libraries are one of those places, but there's not as many as there can be and there need to be. And And so the idea of intergenerational gathering places is an idea that's a priority that's high on our list. That sense of connection is so central for young and old. I think that goes hand in hand then with feeling a sense of purpose. The purpose can be as simple as companionship, not feeling isolated, moving from isolation to inclusion is a key theme that we come back to. So the increased sense of purpose and meaning, and they talk about that in terms of healthy aging. It's really one of the cornerstones of healthy aging. And that lends itself, as we sort of talked earlier, about more opportunities to learn, to create, to work together. It doesn't have to be just a momentary get together in the library or in the senior center. It could be, let's work on a project together. Let's, bring attention to our city around something younger and older and families and caregivers all think is important. So learning opportunities writ large is another important reason for intergenerational work in the community.
Yeah, one of the things, there are so many negative stereotypes and ageism about not only adults, but the kids also. There was a period of time when no one wanted to have teen parties because they always got such a bad rap. And at that point, the senior center was open to allowing the teens to have a party at the senior center on a Friday night once a month. And it was made a huge difference. Not only did the seniors see that these kids aren't all that bad. And they're just having a good time together. And the teens felt like there's a place we can go. And through that, a lot of times we'd have teens coming and saying, hey, we want to do some service for the center. And I always put people to work. So it was no problem at all finding something for them to do. But just having that intermingling, there's aha moments of these kids aren't that bad, or those old people aren't as crabby and out of sync, even though we don't always speak the same language, we can always figure it out.
Monica reminded me of just a quick anecdote from my time in New Orleans when we were working there. One of the big emphasis that we had with the libraries as they were rebuilding and reimagining what they could become, in addition to their historic roles, we looked at some of the great themes of New Orleans. Those of you who have been there, you'll know music and food, the French Quarter for architecture. And we talked to the libraries about how to become more active presenters and champions for those things that make their city special. And so they embraced the idea of doing more around those kind of themes. You each may have themes in your communities that make particular sense to draw from. And I was reminded of it because one of the features that a number of the libraries started doing was having music both in or near the library, on the grounds of the library. And they obviously had a lot to draw from in terms of participants, but it was a wonderful kind of new way of talking about what the libraries could be, and it really did appeal across the generations. I would say one other note on that is, whatever you want to do that's more intergenerationally focused, you're going to need support. You're going to need more than interest and more than experience even. You're going to need support from within your institution, and then hopefully awareness and support from the community as well. So those are two critical elements of making anything succeed. You know, getting your leadership in your library on board, and then getting other community leaders interested in collaborating are very important.
Next slide.
Yep. And these are just a few of the things we've been doing so far. We started, there's a young group or a group of young people in Ypsi that is very big on chess. And so last August, we had them come and sort of learn with our seniors or our older adults how to play chess and how to have fun with it. And it has become a monthly thing that now actually the library is in charge of at the Senior Center. Once our Michigan Avenue branch comes back, they will be meeting at the library. But once a month, a bunch of people come together. There's probably about 15 teens. And right now we have about 5 or 6, I think, older adults that come. And it's funny because it's mostly men that come for chess. I don't know why. And they work together and play together during the day. And one important thing I've always said is we always have to have snacks because some of these kids haven't eaten in a while. And then the other thing we did twice last year, and we're planning on doing it again in the fall, is Growing Hope, which is an organization that promotes healthy eating and farming, basically urban farming, has come to the center, and they have a teen group that comes, and the teens and the older adults make a meal together. And they learn how to cook, how to do certain things like, I think there's roasted beets here, which, you know, what teen wants to eat roasted beets? But they all ate them and they all enjoyed it. And it was just a really fun time. And we're hoping to not only continue it in the fall, the summer's too busy with actual farming. So they'll be doing it in the fall again, and hopefully we'll have more older adults participate because it was really a fun time. And then they eat together, so it's a social time also.
I know we're getting near the end. I just wanted to add one other quick activity that we couldn't represent easily on the photos. We got some money by way of the federal government through the ARPA distribution. I don't know whether any of your libraries also were eligible for ARPA money from the pandemic, but we got money through our county that is allowing us to do some physical redesign to spaces inside the senior center and just on the adjacent outside areas. And we have the plan is to have younger and older people help us design those spaces so that we might have an outdoor patio area that will be much more appealing and usable for broad activities, some outdoor exercise and fitness areas, an area for a lot of games. The chess set that you see here is an inside chess set, but we want to get one of those large outdoor chess sets to put next to a bocce court, to put next to a shuffleboard. So there's any number of ways that there's increasing common areas and activities. And as I mentioned, play and food are at the heart of it. By design, important phrase.
Okay, these are the foundations that we've worked with the past couple of years. The Ann Arbor Area Community Foundation has given us a 3-year grant. Blue Cross Blue Shield Foundation has also given us they gave us a 1-year grant, and then the county has given us an ARPA funding that we can, that's where we're getting the funding to do the inside and outside work at the center. But right now, we've got a lot of other things in the works, but these are the 3 that have really helped us through the past couple of years.
And we also mentioned that they didn't make it on here, but the earliest money came from the Michigan Health Endowment Fund, which is a really good funder statewide. The greater Detroit area, you obviously have the community foundation there. You'd have to get their attention. You might be able to do it as a group of libraries and talk about your historic role, the legacy role you've had, but also the new role you'd like to play in helping bring any number of the things we've talked about today to your greater Detroit community, greater Southeast, this is Flint and some of the outlying areas a little further up from Detroit are part of the group, I recognize. What's our time?
We still have about 5 minutes. We could even bleed into our bathroom break if there's some question and answer, because I see there's some chat that I didn't want to, since we're recording, I didn't want to break in. But let's check.
Is there anything that comes up that would, I know we're going to have some more designated period to talk about some questions people are raising, but if there's anything that comes to mind, I know it's hard not having direct.
I'm going to ask my cohort Saxony was skimming through the chat. Saxony, if you want to unmute, if there were any questions that came up.
Resources.
Holly C. had her question answered in the chat regarding any possible marketing tips.
Okay.
Actually, one good one that we have is we always distribute our newsletters in the libraries, and they send their newsletters to be distributed with us. So we have a good partnership in that one.
I know the last of the slide presentation includes some of the resources, just a very short list. We wanted to give you a flavor of some things. I keep looking up because the screen.
We got it to
the screen here, but I'll look at my screen. So the front part with some of the reports is heavily weighted towards Generations United, which again, gu.org. I would encourage you to take a look there. The second category was what we refer to as resource libraries, and besides Generation United, there is a National Center on Grand Families that has been created. I mentioned Penn State Extension Program, and there's others. There's a number of organizations, again, in addition to Generations United. ARP has its experience core. It also has age-friendly resources and livable communities. They have some really wonderful materials. There's other intergenerational organizations, one called Generation to Generation, which is actually part of what is now called CoGenerate, which does some really excellent work. Again, they're on the national level, but they're a good source. And then last, a couple of the funders. It's interesting, I've talked about both coming from philanthropy and working part of my career in philanthropy. Intergenerational is not a priority for a lot of funders. However, I would argue everything you do can be presented in an intergenerational way that could get to the ones who are interested in health, are interested in children's issues, are interested in environment. Climate, for example, is a critical issue for young and old. Young people feel very strongly about climate change and climate threats. Older people are very much affected by climate changes and hot summers and cold, what used to be colder winters. But hot summers in particular and bad air quality are common issues facing young and old. Water quality. So I would argue that even though funders are not naturally with the exception of the ones listed here, the Eisner Foundation, the John Hartford Foundation, and Grant Makers in Aging, which is the kind of umbrella organization for all national aging funders, make your case anyways, and even introducing a new way of thinking about the work that is through an intergenerational approach could be very appealing, and it would be something a little newer. You just have to break through. I know it's not easy, but so I will stop there unless Monica has any.
No, unless we have any more questions.
And
And we'll be sharing the slides after, right, Aaron?
Yes,
Yes.
yeah, so along with folks will be, everyone will be receiving a digital brochure that we have put together from this event. And we'll also include Bruce and Monica's PowerPoint that's right here and Alexis's PowerPoint. And then we are going to be saving the TLN will save the chat. So we'll pull any questions that were brought up and maybe make a list of the Q&A so that can also be shared. So all the information will be kind of neatly packaged after the event to be sent out afterwards. Yeah. Well, Bruce and Monica, thank you again very much for your time and yeah, being part of this. I'm glad that we got it all together. So at this point, we were going to take a 5 to 10 minute break. I'm checking our little event timeline here. So we had said we'll take a 10-minute bathroom and screen break for all of us. And then we'll introduce Alexis around 11:10. So if anybody wants to get up and take a break, or if you want to stay here and unmute so that you can chat together or use the chat to converse, I think anything is fair game for a few minutes.